The autumn air was crisp on the morning the Ashworth family carriage rolled up the long gravel drive of Blackmore Hall. The wheels crunched over stones still damp from the night's rain, and mist clung to the hedges like a shy guest unwilling to leave. Inside the carriage sat Lord Reginald Ashworth, a man of ambition and careful calculation, his wife Lady Ashworth, who fussed constantly with her gloves, and their 3 daughters. Cordelia, the eldest, sat with her chin lifted, already rehearsing clever remarks in her mind. Mary Ann, the second daughter, checked her reflection in a small hand mirror for the 3rd time that hour, and at the far end of the bench, half hidden by the folds of her plain wool coat, sat Eliza, the youngest, who had long ago learned not to expect much attention from anyone. The Duke of Blackmore, Alaric Thorne, had sent an invitation weeks earlier under the polite excuse of an autumn gathering, but everyone in London society understood the true purpose behind it. At 32 years old, unmarried, and burdened with the full weight of his family's title and estate, the Duke was expected to choose a wife before the year came to an end. Lord Ashworth, always alert to opportunity, had practically promised his family and friends that one of his daughters would return from Blackmore Hall as its future duchess. When the carriage finally stopped before the grand stone entrance, a line of servants stood waiting to greet them. The Duke himself stepped forward, tall and composed, his expression polite but distant, the look of a man who had greeted many hopeful families before this one, and expected little difference this time. Cordelia was the first to step down, offering a bright smile and an immediate compliment about the architecture of the hall. Mary Ann followed, arranging her skirts carefully as she descended, making sure the afternoon light caught the shine of her hair. Eliza came last, quiet as always, murmuring a soft greeting before stepping back to let her sisters take the lead, just as she had done for as long as she could remember. That evening, at the first dinner, the long table gleamed with polished silver and candlelight. Cordelia spoke at length about books she had read, and opinions she had formed on politics and poetry, clearly hoping to impress the Duke with her intelligence. Mary Ann, seated closer to him, offered warm smiles and gentle laughter at his every remark, certain that her charm alone would be enough to win his attention. Alaric responded to both with polite nods and brief replies, his mind clearly elsewhere, though neither sister seemed to notice. At the far end of the table, Eliza ate quietly, answering only when someone spoke directly to her, which was rarely. She was used to being the daughter people forgot to ask about, the one whose opinions were never requested, and whose presence was rarely missed. She did not mind, or so she told herself. She had built a quiet peace around her own thoughts, finding comfort in small things, the pattern of the tablecloth, the sound of rain against the windows, the careful arrangement of flowers in a vase nearby. On the 2nd day of their stay, trouble arrived in a small but important form. The housekeeper of Blackmore Hall, a woman named Mrs. Whitfield who had served the family for over 20 years, fell suddenly ill with a fever. The household was thrown into a quiet panic, for she alone managed the daily tea service that the Duke insisted upon, a tradition passed down from his father before him. Without being asked, Eliza rose from her seat that afternoon and offered to help. She had grown up watching her own family's housekeeper prepare tea, and had always found the process calming, almost like a small ceremony of patience and care. The staff, surprised but grateful, allowed her into the kitchen, where she learned quickly which blends the Duke preferred and how he liked them prepared. That first afternoon, she carried the tray herself into the drawing room, where her sisters were busy entertaining the Duke with stories and laughter. She poured quietly, careful not to interrupt the conversation, setting each cup down without a sound. No one thanked her. No one seemed to notice her at all, except for the Duke, whose eyes lifted briefly from his conversation with Mary Ann to watch the steady, careful way Eliza handled the delicate porcelain. He said nothing that day, but he noticed. The following afternoon, the same routine repeated itself. Eliza prepared the tea, carried it in, and served it without drawing attention to herself. This time, as she poured his cup, the Duke asked quietly, almost as an afterthought, whether the tea was Darjeeling. Eliza nodded and replied that she remembered someone once mentioning his father had preferred it over Assam, though she could not recall exactly where she had heard it. In truth, she had heard it from one of the older servants during her first day at the hall, a small detail she had simply chosen to remember. Alaric said nothing more, but something in his expression shifted, subtle enough that only someone paying close attention would have noticed. Neither of her sisters, absorbed in their own performances, saw it at all. Over the following days, a quiet pattern began to form. While Cordelia continued to debate philosophy and literature with the Duke, and Mary Ann continued to arrange herself in flattering light near windows and mirrors, Alaric found himself glancing toward the tea room more often than he might have expected. He began finding reasons to visit it, a request for a second cup, a comment about the weather, a question about which garden herbs grew nearby. Eliza, for her part, had no idea that her quiet presence was becoming something the Duke looked forward to. She simply continued doing what she had always done, observing quietly, working carefully, and staying out of the way of attention she did not believe she deserved. One afternoon, while her sisters napped after a long walk through the gardens, Eliza wandered into the estate's conservatory, a glass room filled with plants that had clearly been neglected for some time. Vines grew wild across the shelves, and dust covered the glass panes, dimming the sunlight that should have poured through freely. Without thinking much of it, she began tidying the space, trimming overgrown leaves and wiping down the windows, simply because she could not bear to see something so full of potential left to wither. The Duke found her there an hour later, her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of dirt on her cheek, entirely unaware that he stood watching from the doorway. When she finally noticed him, she quickly apologized, worried she had overstepped by touching something that was not hers to touch. Alaric shook his head and told her not to apologize. He admitted that the conservatory had once been his mother's favorite room, but since her passing, no one had cared for it properly. He asked what she thought of the estate as a whole, genuinely curious for the first time in the visit about an honest opinion rather than a rehearsed compliment. Eliza considered the question carefully before answering. She said the gardens were neglected, yes, but the bones of the house were beautiful, strong, well-built, full of quiet potential that simply needed someone to notice it and care for it properly. She added, almost without meaning to, that it reminded her a little of how people could be too, sometimes overlooked simply because no one had taken the time to look closely. Alaric was silent for a long moment. Then, for what the household staff later whispered was the first time in over a year, he smiled, not the polite, practiced smile he offered his guests, but something quieter and more genuine. From that day forward, small moments between them multiplied. He would find her in the library sorting through old books that no one else bothered to read, and they would discuss the stories quietly for a few minutes before someone else entered the room. He would join her in the conservatory in the early mornings, helping her repot small plants while she explained, patiently, why certain flowers needed more shade than others. These were not grand romantic gestures. They were small, simple moments of shared quiet, but they meant more to Alaric than any of the polished conversations he had endured with Cordelia, or the practiced smiles he had received from Marianne. Meanwhile, Cordelia and Marianne remained largely unaware of what was happening beneath their notice. Cordelia continued to believe her intelligence would eventually win the Duke over, certain that a man of his position would value a sharp mind above all else. Marianne remained confident that her beauty alone would be enough, certain that no man could resist her for long. Neither sister thought to ask where the Duke disappeared to during quiet afternoons, nor did they think to wonder why Eliza always seemed to return from her own quiet errands with a faint, private smile. As the final days of the visit approached, Lord Ashworth grew impatient. He had expected a proposal by now, certain that either Cordelia or Marianne would have secured the Duke's affection through their obvious efforts. He began pressing his elder daughters to be bolder, to ensure that whatever chance remained would not be wasted. On the evening before the family was set to depart, a formal dinner was arranged, more elegant than any before it. Candles lined the long table, and the finest dishes the kitchen could prepare were served one after another. Cordelia spoke more boldly than ever, determined to leave a lasting impression. Marianne wore her finest gown, certain this would be the night the Duke finally made his intentions clear. Eliza, as she had done every evening, quietly helped serve the tea after the meal, expecting nothing more than to fade into the background as she always had. But this time, as she finished pouring the final cup, the Duke rose from his seat and asked, in a clear voice that the entire table could hear, whether Miss Eliza Ashworth might join him for a private word in the tea room. The table fell silent. Cordelia's smile faltered. Marianne's hand froze mid-air. Lord Ashworth, confused but hopeful that perhaps this was simply a formality, before an announcement involving one of his other daughters, nodded his permission. Eliza followed the Duke into the small tea room where so many of their quiet conversations had taken place. She was nervous, uncertain what he wished to say, and worried she had somehow done something wrong. Alaric turned to face her, his expression calm but sincere. He told her that over the course of her family's visit, he had been surrounded by conversations designed to impress him, smiles crafted to charm him, and words chosen carefully to win his favor. He admitted that at first, he had expected nothing different from her, assuming she too would eventually attempt the same performance as her sisters. But she never had. He explained that in her, he had found something he had not encountered in years: honesty without performance, kindness without expectation of reward, and quiet strength that did not need to announce itself to be real. He told her that he did not wish for a duchess who could recite poetry flawlessly or command a room with beauty alone. He wished for someone who noticed the things others overlooked, who cared for neglected gardens simply because they deserved care, and who had, without even realizing it, done the same for him. Eliza stood in stunned silence, certain she had misunderstood. She asked, hesitantly, why he would choose her over her sisters, who were clearly more accomplished and more suited to the role of duchess by every traditional standard. Alaric answered simply that he had spent his entire life surrounded by people who performed for his title, seeking favor or advantage. In her, for the first time, he had found someone who had never once tried to win him over, and it was precisely that honesty which had won him completely. Overwhelmed, Eliza asked for a moment to gather her thoughts. Alaric nodded, patient as ever, and waited quietly while she processed what had just been offered to her. A life she had never imagined for herself, a role she had never once believed she deserved. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were steady, though tears threatened at their edges. She told him softly that she had spent her whole life believing she was the daughter no one noticed, the one who faded into corners while her sisters shone. She admitted she did not know how to be seen so completely, nor how to accept being chosen when she had never once expected it. Alaric took her hand gently, and told her that being seen did not require her to change who she was. It simply required someone willing to look closely enough to notice what had always been there. Eliza, moved beyond words, finally accepted. When the couple returned to the dining room, the news spread quickly through the household and, within days, through all of London society. Cordelia was furious, convinced some mistake had been made, certain her wit and intelligence should have secured the match. Marianne felt deeply wounded, unable to understand how her beauty had failed to win a man so easily charmed by others in the past. Lord Ashworth, while surprised, quickly softened his disappointment upon realizing that a duchess had been secured for his family regardless of which daughter wore the title, and he wasted no time boasting of the connection to his associates. Eliza, who had arrived at Blackmore Hall expecting to remain invisible, as she always had, departed as its future duchess. She had not won the Duke's heart through clever words or careful beauty, but through simple, consistent honesty, through steady hands pouring tea, through neglected gardens quietly tended, through quiet conversations no one else had thought to have. In the months that followed, as wedding preparations began and London buzzed with surprise at the unexpected match, Eliza remained largely unchanged. She continued to tend the conservatory herself, refusing to hand the task entirely to the staff. She continued to remember small details others forgot, checking on servants who had fallen ill, and remembering birthdays that even family members overlooked. And Alaric, watching her move quietly through the halls of Blackmore, found himself grateful every day that he had chosen to look a little closer, past the daughter everyone expected him to choose, toward the one who had been quietly, patiently herself all along. Years later, when people asked the Duke and Duchess of Blackmore how their love story had begun, Alaric would smile and simply say that some of the most important things in life are easy to overlook, until someone finally takes the time to notice them properly. And Eliza, standing quietly beside him as she always had, would simply smile back, no longer the forgotten daughter, but the quiet heart of a home finally seen for everything she truly was.